That morning, the town of Elkhorn basked in sunlight. Locals laid out their stalls for the weekend market as usual, baskets of fruit in woven trays, golden-crusted bread at Mrs. Mary's stand, and the old ice cream truck circling with its familiar faded jingle. 10-year-old Eli Carter, holding a vanilla ice cream cone, was chasing after his father, Mr. Carter, a machine repairman, while his mother laughed near the vegetable stand. It was a peaceful morning, seemingly no different from hundreds before it, until the screech of metal rang from the rooftop of the red brick building across the street. Then, bang, a gunshot fired not into the air, but directly into the crowd. Before anyone could grasp what was happening, someone collapsed. Screams, cries, and panic erupted. Everything descended into chaos. A second, then a third shot rang out, blending into the sounds of tires screeching, people shouting, children crying, and market stalls crashing down. Eli froze. His eyes widened. The ice cream fell from his hand, melting onto the stone pavement. He saw his father fall, first blood soaking through the white shirt. His mother ran toward him, but before she could reach him, another bullet tore through the air. She collapsed, clutching her chest. Her eyes fixed on Eli, trying to say something, but no words came. Everything afterward faded, as though someone had shut off the sound inside his head. This wasn't a random shooting. It was a calculated purge, a message sent by two rival underground factions. And it was a warning delivered to the local authorities by Black Talon, a covert organization that trafficked weapons and controlled criminal markets across multiple states. The Carter family, whether by chance or not, had crossed paths with a compromised shipment. Mr. Carter once repaired a printer at a warehouse later exposed. They weren't murdered out of vengeance. Their existence had simply become a liability to a much larger operation. By the time the police arrived, only bodies remained, scattered pieces of bread and an ice cream truck scorched at the front. No one saw the shooter. There were no cameras, and no one dared to speak. In the corner of the market, a boy curled beneath an overturned wooden table. His face was dry, no more tears. Just wide-open eyes and the blood soaking through his child-sized shirt, his mother's blood. No one came to claim him. No relatives. No welfare records. And so no one bore responsibility. Except for one person. After 30 minutes of chaos, Elkhorn Market was left with nothing but scattered remnants of everyday life. The ice cream truck was still smoking. Mrs. Mary lay motionless beside her bread stand. A small dog circled its owner's body, whining until it fell silent. Police forces were deployed from 3 counties, but they had all arrived too late. And all of them overlooked Eli. They were too busy collecting bodies, photographing the scene, and gathering bullet casings. No one noticed the boy who didn't cry, didn't call out, didn't ask. He simply sat with his head against a scorched wooden post, his small hand still clutching a torn piece of his mother's shirt, until a pair of worn black shoes stopped in front of him. Old police boots scuffed at the heels and smeared with dirt, not polished like the others. They belonged to Thomas Reed, the regional detention chief, an old officer with no name tag, no gloves, no formal procedure, but who always showed up for the cases no one wanted to touch. He looked at Eli, not with pity, not with professionalism, just looked as if he himself had once sat like that in another place at another time. He sat down. He didn't speak. He didn't touch Eli. He just allowed his presence to fill the silence that was tearing the boy's soul apart. A minute passed, then another. When Eli finally looked up, his eyes were still empty, but his small hand quietly let go of the blood-stained fabric. Thomas handed him a paper cup of warm tea, then pulled out a coarse cloth handkerchief, folded it into quarters, and placed it gently on the boy's knee. No custody papers. No welfare documentation. No official permission. Just a silent decision made by someone who understood pain too well, and a child who for the first time was no longer left behind. The next morning, Eli sat in the back seat of Thomas's pickup truck. The man's coat was too large, covering most of his arms. The vehicle drove slowly toward the edge of town. There stood a two-story wooden house, an old oak tree, and a rocking chair on the porch, always left empty for someone who had lost their way home. Thomas's house was at the end of a narrow dirt road on the western outskirts of Elkhorn, where the map no longer marked clearly. A two-story wooden cabin with a slanted roof and small glass windows that looked out toward the pine forest. Out front was a long porch of weathered planks, where a faded rocking chair sat under the sun. Thomas lived alone. No wife, no children, no visitors. Just cups of coffee left to cool in silence, a few old reports, and a harmonica hanging on the wall that no one had ever seen him play. When he brought Eli home, he didn't say, "This is your home now." He didn't say, "I'll take care of you." He just opened the door, pointed upstairs, and said one quiet sentence, "Room on the right." Light flickers a bit, but it's warm. Eli stepped into an entirely unfamiliar space, but he wasn't afraid. In that small room, he found the one thing he hadn't had in the past 48 hours, a door he could close. The days that followed passed like a slow-motion film. In the mornings, Mr. Thomas brewed 2 cups of coffee, one with milk, one without. Eli didn't drink coffee. He just held the cup to warm his hands. In the afternoons, Thomas would shut the gate, turn off the radio, and sit on the rocking chair reading the newspaper. Eli would sit a few meters away, saying nothing but never leaving. There were no games, no storybooks, just the whisper of the wind beyond the forest, and the soft creaking of wood as the chair moved back and forth like the quiet breath of someone long accustomed to solitude. One time during a storm, the power went out. Thomas lit an oil lamp. Eli whispered, "Will it burn for long?" Thomas replied, "Yes. As long as you keep it close to your heart." No one mentioned the shooting. No one asked Eli if he missed his parents. And perhaps because of that, Eli slowly began to learn how to keep living, not by forgetting, but by learning to live beside the pain without letting it consume him. One evening, Eli saw Mr. Thomas standing beneath the old oak tree behind the house. He wasn't looking at the tree. He simply placed a hand on its trunk, closed his eyes, then quietly walked back inside. Eli didn't ask anything. But from that day on, every day, he would stand at the base of that tree for a few minutes, not to pray, not to wish, just to stand, as if waiting for a root to reach out and touch him. A month passed, then a season. No one noticed how much Eli had changed, but Thomas knew. The boy who had once curled up behind a scorched ice cream truck now lined up his shoes at the door, wiped down the kitchen table, and folded the napkins after every meal. Though he still hadn't called Thomas father, deep down, Eli knew this was the place he would begin again, and the first person he would never lose again. The old oak stood tall behind the wooden house, silent, as if it had borne witness to every change that ever swept across the land. No one remembered exactly when it had been planted. No plaque, no marker, no name. Just, whenever the wind passed through its branches, the leaves would whisper a sound so soft and ancient, it felt like an old story being retold, something impossible to name, but deeply felt. Eli discovered the oak tree by chance one autumn afternoon while following the footprints of a lost squirrel into the backyard. Its canopy stretched wide, swallowing the entire yard beneath it. The last light of the day filtered through the leaves, casting warm golden patches across the ground, much like the gentle glow in his mother's eyes once had. Its roots rose from the earth, twisted like aged arms, reaching into the sky, not to embrace, but to make you want to come closer. The boy sat down at the base of the tree quietly, without thought. And there, for the first time since his parents died, Eli didn't feel cold. That evening, over a simple dinner of hot soup and dark bread, Eli hesitantly asked Thomas, "How old is the oak tree behind the house?" Thomas paused, his eyes fixed on the oil lamp flickering gently in the breeze, then answered slowly, without looking at Eli, "Older than anything you can remember. But certainly, younger than the things it's already seen." He said no more. But to Eli that answer was as complete as a lesson. From that day on, the oak tree became Eli's quiet retreat each morning and every afternoon after school. No one told him to go. No one led the way. It was simply where his feet took him, as if something at the tree's roots silently held his soul in place. Some days he would sit under its shade for hours, listening to the wind weave through its branches, breathing in the damp scent of soil after rain, and gazing at the sunlight that sifted through the leaves the color of the clothes his mother once wore. On other days, he brought a small, clumsy sketch, a drawing of an old man, a boy, and a very large tree standing between them. He never said who they were, and Thomas never asked. But that night, the old man stood on the porch longer than usual, his eyes fixed on the silhouette of the tree fading into the soft evening mist. When winter came and the wind turned suddenly cold, Eli still sat beneath the oak tree, curled into his oversized sweater. Thomas brought out a low wooden chair and placed it beside him. He didn't call, Eli didn't invite him to sit. He simply left it there the way one might leave a space open for memory to sit beside them. Eli climbed onto the chair, looked up at the tree, and asked quietly, almost as if speaking to himself, "If one day it's no longer here, who will keep its place?" Thomas was silent for a long time, then answered softly, his voice nearly fading into the breeze, "As long as you remember where it once stood." It never really left. From that day on, each morning before leaving the house, Eli placed his hand on the tree's trunk. He didn't pray. He didn't wish. He simply touched it, as if that was his way of holding on to the one thing in his life that had never disappeared. People often think memory lives in the mind, but in truth, it lives in the hands when we touch a tree trunk, a piece of wood, or a root that once bore witness to our growing up. The oak behind the house wasn't a father, wasn't a mother, and wasn't Thomas either. But it was the place where all of Eli's pain was folded and tucked into silence so that his heart would still have room for other kinds of love to grow. In the spring of his 18th year, the town of Elkhorn entered its first thaw after 3 dry winters. The oak tree began to sprout tiny green buds, so small one had to sit very still to see them tremble in the sunlight. Eli still sat at the base of the tree every morning, placing his hand against its trunk like a ritual no one had taught him, as if listening for something that echoed up from deep within the earth. That morning, Thomas found an envelope laid neatly on the kitchen table. No one had handed it to him. There was no formal request. On the outside of the envelope was a single line handwritten in black ink, I think. "It's time I stood up." Inside was an application form to the State Police Academy, complete with a fully filled-out profile, a recent photo, and the only existing copy of Eli's birth certificate listing his legal guardian as Thomas Reed. There was no explanation, no cover letter. It was just a silent gesture, resolute, much like the way Eli had been brought home at the age of 10. Thomas read to the bottom of the page, then looked up through the window. Outside, Eli was chopping wood. Each strike was firm and steady, and his eyes no longer belonged to a child. Thomas didn't ask why. He simply reached into a drawer and took out an old folding knife, worn and faded, with 3 barely legible letters engraved on its handle, "Reed Tr." He placed it beside the application. He didn't say a word. When the acceptance letter arrived, Thomas didn't say congratulations, and he didn't hug Eli. He just woke up early, made 2 cups of coffee, placed them on the table, and opened the door of his old pickup truck, his way of saying, "It's time." They didn't speak during the entire 300-mile drive. Only when they reached the gates of the academy did Eli step out, pause, and turn back. He said slowly, "I know I wasn't born into your family, but I promise if one day you ever need me, I'll come back. And if I fall, I hope it's wearing the same uniform you once wore." Thomas gave a single nod, very slow. He didn't smile, but his eyes were red, and he turned his face away so Eli wouldn't see. Over the next 4 years, Eli rarely came home. He trained, studied law, forensic science, rapid response tactics, and quietly reopened the case of the shooting from years ago, a file that had been closed under the claim of insufficient evidence of an organized plot. He never told Thomas, because he knew Thomas didn't need to know. The old man only needed to see Eli standing tall on graduation day in uniform, wearing his official badge. And when Eli approached him, he didn't salute. He simply stood straight, nodded like 2 men meeting eye to eye for the first time. Thomas didn't say, "I'm proud of you." But that night, when they returned to the wooden house, he hung a new photo on the wall. Eli in police uniform standing before the oak tree, his hand resting on the same spot he always touched. The photo was framed in wood and placed between 2 old, faded photographs, ones no one had ever asked Thomas about. Eli became a criminal investigator assigned to a federal task force working directly under Thomas in a special unit dedicated to dismantling organized crime. And this was when Eli's true plan began. Not just to solve cases, but to return to the very place where his parents had once fallen. Not out of hatred, but to call the truth by its rightful name, the one long left behind. The night before Eli began his first official week of training with the Special Investigation Unit, Thomas called him up to the attic, an old space that had never been opened before. The room was small, low-ceilinged, and thick with dust. At the center stood a wooden table so aged its edges had worn smooth. On it sat a single metal box secured with 2 locks. Thomas said nothing as he opened it carefully, unlatching each fastener like he was handling a piece of the past he'd spent a lifetime burying. Inside were just 2 items, an old police badge tarnished to a dull gray bronze and a folding knife blade worn engraved with 3 letters TRE. He placed both items on the table and turned to Eli. "This badge once got me through doors no one else could walk through. But this knife, this kept me alive to walk back out." Eli looked at them without speaking. Thomas picked up the knife, unfolded it slowly. The blade gleamed beneath the attic's yellow bulb, not reflecting light, but time. "Being a cop isn't just about knowing the law," Thomas said, voice low, firm. "It's about knowing who writes it, and knowing when it stops serving justice." He stepped forward and placed the knife into Eli's hand, his fingers trembling, not from age, but because he understood when a father hands his child a weapon, it means he accepts the child may one day face blood. Eli closed his hand around the knife. For the first time, his grip no longer felt like a child's. It felt like the hand of someone who would have to choose what's right in a world where nothing is black and white. Thomas looked Eli square in the eyes. The gaze wasn't that of an old man. It was the gaze of someone who had once seen the truth in the darkest corners of the world. "Remember this, Eli. Not all the bad guys are in prison. Some wear uniforms. Some sit at high tables. And they are the most dangerous of all." The attic grew darker as Eli descended the stairs, the knife tucked inside his jacket pocket and the old badge resting in the palm of his hand. Not to show off, not as a keepsake, but as a reminder to himself from this moment on, every step he takes is a step of someone who survived pain and chose to stand up instead of surrendering. Special Investigation Room 14 was located in the basement of the state police headquarters. No sign, no guard, and the door always locked behind 2 layers of security codes. Eli was transferred there under a no-disclosure federal order and paired with Thomas as part of an internal handover. On paper, they were partners. But everyone knew the oldest man in the room was the real leader, and the youngest was always the one who stayed the latest after every shift. Their first case was not a major one. It was simply a series of reports about missing guns from evidence lockers at small police stations. On the surface, it seemed like carelessness, but Thomas didn't believe in coincidence. He tapped the table and showed Eli a map, 3 cases of missing weapons from 3 different stations, but when connected, using an old traffic map, all 3 lay on a route once used as an illegal transport corridor by a shadow organization disbanded 10 years ago. Eli held the map up. It took him just 3 minutes to realize Red Talon. They're coming back. Thomas nodded slowly. And this time, they don't need to hide their guns, because the ones opening the doors for them wear the same uniform as us. The investigation lasted 2 weeks. Eli and Thomas moved constantly from the evidence warehouse at Newbury Station that had been written off to the Benton headquarters, where cameras were mysteriously offline for maintenance. Every place they visited had one thing in common: the manager was never present, and the officer on duty that day had been reassigned. Eli began to see clearly what Thomas had warned him. Not every criminal comes from outside. Sometimes they meet you every morning, laugh, pour coffee, then sign papers to get rid of the evidence out the back door. One evening, while reviewing old footage from warehouse number 4, Eli spotted a familiar figure, a man wearing a baseball cap, limping slightly on his right leg. He zoomed in the face, half hidden in flickering light. But those eyes had appeared before in Eli's memory in that morning long ago at the market when his mother had fallen. Eli's heart skipped a beat. Sweat poured down despite the cold air conditioning. He said only 3 dry words: "I recognize him." Thomas was silent. He didn't ask, "Are you sure?" He only placed his hand lightly on Eli's shoulder, just a gentle press. A nod. A signal. It's time we do more than just solve cases. It's time to uncover a buried truth. From that day forward, Eli and Thomas were no longer mere partners. They became an underground team within the system, solving new cases while reopening old wounds. Every day at work was like wading through murky waters, not knowing who was watching, who was taking notes. But they had each other, one old, one young. One who had survived, one who had grown from loss. And together they stepped deeper into a den they both knew held no way back if they stumbled. 3 days after Eli recognized the face in the blurry footage, his personal email inbox received an anonymous message. No subject, no sender. Just a single line. Don't dig up what's been buried. Graves know how to defend themselves. Eli read it over and over, analyzing it out of habit. But deep inside, he knew this wasn't a random threat. It was a warning from someone who knew exactly who he was and what he was digging up. He said nothing to Thomas, not out of secrecy, but because he knew Thomas was all too familiar with this kind of dead letter. Instead, Eli quietly checked his phone, changed all his passwords, and deleted every piece of data from the cloud. That night, Eli left the headquarters later than usual. A light rain fell, and the town's streets were shrouded in mist like a thin veil across his eyes. He got into his car, a modest sedan he'd bought in his first year on the job. Buckling his seatbelt, he turned on the lights and started driving. The winding forest road home was less than 5 miles, but was the only moment Eli could breathe quietly. Until, approaching a downhill curve, he pressed the brake and nothing happened. The brake pedal felt empty. The car began to skid. Time seemed to slow. Eli gripped the steering wheel tightly, jerked it hard to the right, scraping against the rocky roadside, then sliding further. Trees rushed past on both sides like giant shadows reaching for him. With extraordinary effort and a few deep scrapes across his shoulder, Eli pulled the handbrake, swerved the car up the hillside, and the car plunged into a water ditch, flipping onto its side. Glass shattered. His knee was torn. But he was still alive. When the support team arrived, everyone assumed it was just a simple accident from slipping on the road. Only Thomas didn't believe it. He came to the hospital, saw Eli with his knee bandaged, and didn't ask, "Are you okay?" Instead, he asked directly, "The front brake completely failed." Eli nodded. Thomas sat down, opened an old notebook, pulled out a list of names, and crossed out one that had been connected to the evidence storage years ago. Then he tossed Eli a small object, a tracking chip evidence recovered from under Eli's car. This time, they didn't send a letter. They sent a message in cold steel. That night, Eli didn't go home. He stayed at the office, reopening all the old case files, not only about the shooting years ago, but also about the list of officers who had been abruptly transferred after that incident. Some names matched people working alongside him every day. Some signatures appeared in both places, the lost weapons files and the documents closing the case on his parents. Eli didn't tremble. He didn't get angry. He quietly placed a photo on the desk, the wedding picture of his mother and father. "I promised. I will find everything, both the shooter and the one who handed the gun to them." At 3:17 a.m., Special Investigation Room 14 was lit only by a single screen. Eli sat there flipping through yellowed, blurred pages with very clear signatures. One name appeared 3 times across 3 different files. Officer Malcolm Reese, the one who had led the crime scene investigation at the Elkhorn Market, shooting the first person present after the Black Talon organization disappeared, and the one who signed off on closing the case, due to lack of reliable surviving witnesses. The only survivor then was Eli, and because he was only 10 years old, his testimony had been dismissed as psychologically unstable, low recognition ability, insufficient basis for conclusion. The note closed the entire case as if the truth wasn't worth revisiting. Eli pulled the original files from the metal clamp and reassembled the crime scene photos, his father lying face down, blood trailing toward his mother. His mother lying sideways, hands still reaching out to Eli. He no longer cried. His pain had turned to stone. All that remained was a map, a list, a goal. That morning, Thomas entered the office and saw everything spread across the walls, old photos, connection diagrams, printed inventory cards, and among them all the photo of Officer Malcolm Reese. Eli stood up, offered no excuses, and simply said, "I can't let this file sit locked away another day." Thomas stared into Eli's eyes, neither opposing nor agreeing, only whispering in a voice rough as gravel mixed with smoke, "I once thought that if we stayed silent long enough, it would die. But some things, the deeper you bury them, the stronger their roots grow." Together they went to the regional archive where the original shooting case files were sealed in safe A41. Thomas used the old card, and no one stopped them. They stepped into a room cold as a morgue, where hundreds of metal cabinets stood stacked like a graveyard of truth. Eli searched for the original files of Operation Dust Veil, the code name the government had assigned to the series of actions against Black Talon over 10 years ago. Inside was only a thin folder nearly empty with just one page left, unredacted, a rough schematic linking 3 prisons, an old gas station, and the Elkhorn Market. Eli looked at the map, then turned to Thomas. This wasn't an isolated terrorist attack. It was a cleanup operation. And my parents were on the list to be eliminated. That night, Eli returned to the oak tree behind the house. He sat there for a long time holding a faded photo of his parents. The night wind was cold. Leaves fell silently. He didn't cry, only whispered, "I won't demand justice. I will create it myself." Nestled deep within the rocky hills west of town, Red Rock Cabin was nowhere to be found on any official map. Locals only knew it as an old abandoned wooden house, a shelter hunters sometimes used when sudden fog rolled in. But Thomas knew well it had once been a strategic transfer point for the Black Talon organization. And more than once, it was the place he hadn't reached in time. That afternoon, Eli drove his foster father's old car, stopping at the edge of the hill, before a path barely wide enough for a single tire. The wind lashed cold bursts. The trees were withered. The ground scattered with red rocks, the color of dried blood mixed with dust of forgotten time. Thomas got out, first stepping slowly. With every step, he seemed to sink deeper, touching failures he had never spoken about. Eli didn't ask. He knew when a man like Thomas stayed silent for over 10 years, it wasn't because he forgot, but because he could never forgive himself. Red Rock Cabin appeared like a shadow in the mist. The roof tiles were rotten, the door hung askew, and the crooked roof bent like the back of someone who had carried too much guilt. Thomas stood before the door, placed his hand on the hinge, hesitated, then turned to Eli with weary eyes. "In 2011, I was ordered to surround this place. Intelligence said there was a Black Talon internal meeting here. But when we arrived, everything had been burned to ashes. No documents, no people, only a handkerchief stained with blood embroidered with the first 3 letters of your mother's name." Eli froze. Every cell in his heart seemed to harden. He had never heard this before, had never known his mother had once been here. Inside the house was in disarray, but Eli noticed one thing, a long scratch on the floorboards near the fireplace, as if something had been dragged out and then hastily closed back. He crouched down, lifted it, an underground door. Below was a small cellar just tall enough to stand and dark enough to see nothing without a light. They descended. The flashlight beam revealed items covered in dust for over a decade, a wooden board with maps of weapon routes pinned to it. A faded Polaroid photo showing a man wearing a baseball cap, the same man Eli had recognized from the tape, and a leather-bound notebook intact. Eli opened it. The first page read, "Recipient List, Federal Law Enforcement Internal." Thomas gripped the cellar railing tightly, exhaled deeply, leaned against the wall, and for the first time in his life, Eli saw him tremble. "I came here, just hours after they left. If I had arrived sooner, maybe your mother would still be alive, but I wasn't allowed to come sooner. Orders came from above." Eli looked up at him without blame. He silently placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder and whispered softly, "So this time, if I have to come earlier, would you dare not ask for anyone's permission anymore?" Thomas looked deeply into Eli's eyes and nodded. They left the cabin as dusk settled, the sunset painting the rocky hills red. The wind carried the scent of decayed grass, dried blood, and the promise of a chase about to begin. Because this time, they were not returning with a clue, but with a list of names. And on that list, not criminals, but colleagues. 3 days after leaving Red Rock Cabin, Eli and Thomas received an urgent notice from the Internal Affairs Division. An evidence warehouse in the riverside town of Mayfield had been broken into. The intruder took nothing, only leaving a bloody handprint on steel locker number 8. Thomas needed no analysis. Eli asked no hypotheses. Both understood this was not a challenge, but an invitation. The plan was drawn up overnight, precise as before. But this time, there was no official dossier, no backup team, no cameras. Just two men, one old, one young, carrying a past never named, and a truth never dared to be spoken aloud. Thomas handed Eli an old pistol without serial number, once his when he was in intelligence. Eli took it, checked the magazine, asking only one question. "Is there an escape route this time?" Thomas answered in a hoarse voice like an old scar. "Yes, but I'm going the opposite way from you." Before getting into the car, Thomas stood at the wooden house's doorstep, the place that once brought Eli back from the ruins. He slowly turned, looked directly at him, not as a superior, not as a father, but as someone who had tasted life's bitterness fully. "Listen carefully, Eli. If I fall, don't go in. If someone yells my name, don't turn back. If it's so dark inside you can't see anything, let the darkness keep me." Eli clenched his teeth. "I can't stand aside. Not after everything that has happened." Thomas squeezed his shoulder gently, speaking each word like carving it into his chest. "You are my last flame. Don't let it go out just because you try to pull me out of the ashes." They departed at 2:47 a.m. The road to the Mayfield warehouse stretched over 60 miles, cutting through stretches of unmarked highways, cold roadside forests, and fog that hung like a veil, blinding justice itself. No one spoke the entire way. Only the steady hum of the engine and the wiper sweeping across the windshield, like the heartbeat of someone about to step into a place where escape was uncertain. The evidence warehouse appeared like an abandoned morgue. No guards, no lights, no alarms, only a slightly ajar back door, as if someone had been waiting for them for a long time. Thomas signaled Eli to stay back while he silently stepped inside, first his gun concealed in his sleeve. Eli waited exactly 3 minutes as planned. But at the 4th minute, no sign of Thomas returning. And at the 5th, the first gunshot rang out. Eli gripped his gun tightly, eyes fixed on the darkness. Every sense screamed for him to stay still, but his heart had already gone in long ago. Locker number 8 sat silent like a dead beast, yet inside it lived a dark, organized life. Eli slipped through the back door where Thomas had entered first. No signs of struggle, no blood, just an unsettling stillness. In the second basement level, Eli found the internal surveillance control room, a dusty space, seemingly abandoned long ago. He turned on the monitor. Only one was active, displaying Thomas Reed tied to a metal chair, blood seeping from his lip, eyes wide open, but showing no fear. Behind him stood 3 masked, tall figures moving silently, as if trained to erase their presence from any record. One held a pistol, pressing it lightly to Thomas's temple, and spoke the first words Eli barely caught through distorted sound. "You're late as always, Reed. But at least this time." We waited. Eli clenched the control panel, his hands trembling, his body taut like a snapping wire. He activated the internal comm channel, an old one-way system, and tried to speak through knowing Thomas couldn't hear Dad. "I'm here." The screen offered no reply. Only Thomas staring straight into the camera as if certain Eli was watching. And in those eyes, no plea for help, only a single warning repeated silently, "Don't come in." But Eli was no longer the 10-year-old boy. No longer the kid sitting in the back seat with an oversized jacket. He was a cop, but above all, he was a son. Carrying the memories of 2 people killed by the very system operated by those sitting inside. Eli had no arrest warrant, no backup team, only a gun, a folding knife, and a promise if last time his father arrived late, this time he wouldn't wait. Eli pulled Thomas's knife from his jacket pocket and placed it in his palm, the blade cold as winter nights beneath the oak tree. His eyes showed no emotion, only a choice. Inside, his father was held hostage, Outside, every rule warned, "Don't enter." And between those two worlds, Eli crossed the line. Night fell over the evidence warehouse like a shroud. Snow began to fall, thick and silent, white flakes dropping soundlessly, as if even the sky held its breath, waiting to see what would come. Eli didn't wait for orders, didn't call command, didn't leave a farewell note. He simply tied his shoelaces, holstered the gun on his left hip, the folding knife on his right, and put on Thomas's old coat, the same coat that had wrapped him the first day he was brought home. The back entrance of the warehouse was sealed tight, but Eli had studied the layout from the surveillance room. The eastern wall had a ventilation duct connected to the cold storage area once used to keep medical evidence. Crawling through the narrow pipe less than 50 centimeters wide, his stomach scraping the cold metal, Eli bit back any sound as screws grazed beneath him. Each echo from below sounded like his heartbeat pounding against the steel. 3 minutes, then 4. Eli reached the spot that opened into the basement. He stopped, took a deep breath, and opened the lid. No smoke, no alarms. Only a faint yellow light in the distance and the sound of someone tapping lightly on a metal table like the ticking of a countdown clock. Eli moved slowly, silent as a ghost in the very house that had imprisoned all the memories of his life. In his hand was a gun, but inside he heard the voice of his foster father, echoing from their first days in the wooden house. Strength isn't about shooting. The strongest is knowing when not to shoot. He turned down 2 dark corridors, avoiding surveillance cameras by using a mirror hooked from his knife to redirect the light. Ahead was the evidence processing room where Thomas was being held. Eli lay down, pressing his cheek to the floor. Through the gap under the door, he saw shadows of feet and heard a voice say, "You chose the wrong side, Reed. You should have let the past die with that child." Thomas didn't respond. Eli tightened his grip on the gun and then relaxed. He didn't shoot. He didn't break down the door. Instead, he crawled to the adjacent electrical room and cut the main power. All the lights went out instantly. Screams erupted. The soft lock on the door reset in 10 seconds, and that was enough. Eli burst out, kicking open the evidence room door. 2 guards hadn't even turned around before the gun in his hand swung but did not fire. Instead, he struck both with the butt of the gun with the precise speed the academy had trained him for. Thomas was still there, tied up, blood spreading across one shoulder, eyes wide with shock. Eli cut the ropes. Thomas whispered, "I told you, don't come in." Eli lifted him up, his voice calm but as firm as steel. "I'm not coming in because you told me to. I'm coming in because you stepped out for me." They helped each other down the hallway, emergency lights, flickering alarms blaring. The enemy was closing in. No main exit, no rescue team. Only the rooftop route and a rope Eli had brought from the car, just as he had predicted. Step by step, breath by breath, heavier than the wounds they climbed. When they finally stepped outside, snow blanketed the ground. Blood from Thomas's shoulder stained his coat. Eli didn't let him rest or ask if he was okay. He just whispered, as if speaking into the snow, "You taught me how to live. Now that I still need you to teach me, I will bring you home." Snow continued to fall as Eli helped Thomas along the narrow path behind the evidence warehouse. The 2 men, one with a wounded shoulder, the other carrying a heavy burden in his heart, staggered toward the old car parked at the edge of the forest. No one pursued them. No sirens blared. No chase vehicles roared. Only the sound of snow compressed beneath their boots, and Thomas's ragged breathing broken from blood loss, and from the most unexpected truth, the son he once protected was now using his own body to shield him. Inside the car, Eli draped his jacket over Thomas's shoulders and improvised a bandage with a torn seat cover. Thomas looked at him, eyes half doubtful, half unwilling to believe. "Why didn't you retreat? Why didn't you listen to me?" Eli started the engine, eyes fixed ahead. The headlights cut through the thick, snowy haze. His voice was steady and firm like the oath he once took at the academy, but now it was a vow from the heart. "I have lost once before, and that loss is irreparable. But you are the only one left. If I stayed outside, I wouldn't just lose you. I'd lose the part of myself that's human." Thomas turned away, hiding his reddened eyes. He had lived a life governed by principles, silence, and a sobriety mistaken for coldness. But now in this moment, he knew every lesson he had ever taught came back to him in its most perfect form, the son he never gave birth to, but who was the truest heir of all he was. The car rolled along the empty highway, leaving the evidence warehouse and the darkness that had surrounded them for so many years far behind. In the glove compartment, Eli placed Thomas's folding knife, the same knife that had accompanied him all his life, now stained with the blood of the son who had saved him with it. He gently pushed it toward him. "This is yours. But from now on, I will keep it with me. Not to fight, but to remember there was someone who once chose me over the law." Thomas nodded softly, leaning his head against the window and closing his eyes. The wind howled outside, snow clinging to the fogged glass, but with his last strength he whispered, "You have become the man I never dared to dream you would be." 4 weeks after the break-in, Thomas Reed officially submitted his retirement letter. There was no farewell party, no applause, only a silent A4 sheet of paper signed in an old, worn handwriting like the hand that once held the pen. The council did not question it. No one dared to ask further after Eli's glance in the closed-door meeting, when he named 3 officers directly involved in the incident and attached a copy of the evidence file that had disappeared 10 years ago, recovered from the Red Rock vault. No one objected, because everyone understood. In this fight, Eli won. And he didn't win by law, but by an unshakable belief. On the first morning, Thomas didn't come to the office. The wooden desk in the corner of the room remained empty. No one cleaned it away. No nameplates were changed. They just wiped it clean and left a steaming cup of coffee on the left. On the right, another cup. The same style, gray porcelain, no sugar. Eli entered. Not in uniform. Just a white shirt and his shoulder badge. He sat down on the very chair Thomas had occupied for 17 years. He leaned back, silent, gazing at his own hands, now big enough to grasp everything that once made him feel lost. On the desk, a new nameplate lay in a wooden box, E. Carter, Captain, Special Federal Investigations. No one handed it to him. No trumpets sounded. Only Eli himself opened the box, hung it in its place, and nodded silently, as if accepting a duty that needed no permission. That evening, returning to the wooden house at the town's edge, Eli found Thomas sitting on the porch in the old rocking chair, the oak tree behind, still standing like an old guard, refusing to leave his post. Eli did not call him father. Thomas did not ask, "Are you home yet?" Only the wind rustled through the leaves, and a second cup of coffee steamed on the wooden table. Eli sat down beside him, quietly placed Thomas's old nameplate neatly on the table, and softly said, "I don't keep it to remember. I keep it so I never forget why I began." On the living room wall, a new framed photo hung, an old man, a young man, and a tree standing between them, its branches spreading wide, no one bowing their head. And somewhere deep in the hearts of those who have lost, there will always be someone not born of you, but who bends down, places a hand on your shoulder, and teaches you how to stand again. Eli Carter grew up through loss, but he did not become a man of revenge. He became a keeper of the flame so that the light of justice would never go out, even if it flickered faintly in an old office, a cold cup of coffee, or a quiet warning, "If I fall, don't come in." He came in. And that saved a life. And that saved him. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If you have ever been an Eli, someone who lost but was reached out to at the right moment, or if you have ever been a Thomas, silently guarding something greater than yourself, then you know we are not alone. Because somewhere there are people like you, quiet, steadfast, and silently keeping the light alive. If this story touches you, leave it just like Eli once placed his hand on the oak tree, not to pray, but to remember that there is still someone to believe in. And if you want to hear more quiet but profound journeys like this, don't forget to follow the channel. We will continue to tell these stories one by one, enough to leave you still for a few minutes. Then move forward stronger through the rest of your day.